Welcome to the Sci-Fi Rancher story. Here you find the best HFY story written by human. Listen the story. If you like it, subscribe the channel.
I drank her tail juice now. She says I belong to her. Welcome to the world of science fiction. Comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. Jackson's descent onto the planet had been anything but controlled. One moment, he had been cataloging plant samples from the observation deck of the Orpheus 9, and the next, the ship's warning sirens were howling through the metal corridors, red lights flashing, as the gravitational pull of an unknown celestial body wrenched him from orbit. The pilot's frantic voice over the cal had barely been enough to prepare him for the impact, and in truth no amount of training could have truly prepared him for the chaos of a forced descent through an atmosphere thick enough to choke the engines. When the hull began to burn, streaking through the alien sky like a dying comet, all he could do was strap himself in and pray that whatever gods ruled this forgotten corner of the universe would grant him a soft landing. They did not. The crash was a violent cacophony of metal twisting against earth, the forward cabin tearing away from the rest of the ship in a shower of sparks and shattered panels. Gravity crushed against his chest, air stolen from his lungs as he was thrown hard against his restraints, the impact sending shock waves through his skull. Then there was nothing but blackness, a deep and empty void that swallowed his senses. Old Jackson woke to the sharp sting of pain lancing through his ribs, the distant hum of insects and strange creatures filling the humid air. Around him the remains of the ship smoldered in the distance, broken and half submerged in the thick, tangled jungle. He tried to move, but the moment he shifted his body rebelled, agony flaring through his side, where the seat restraints had dug into his flesh. He forced himself upright, swallowing down a groan as he surveyed his surroundings. Enormous trees stretched high above, their bioluminescent leaves casting an eerie green glow across the jungle floor, vines twisting like living things around their trunks. The air was thick with moisture, every breath heavy with the scent of damp earth, and something else, something sweet and almost intoxicating. He was alive, but he wouldn't be for long. If he didn't find water, shelter, and some way to signal for rescue, the Orpheus 9 was gone, its communication systems likely fried beyond repair, and he had no idea if his emergency beacon had survived the crash intact. Gritting his teeth against the pain, he pressed a hand against his ribs, feeling for any sign of a break. Bruised, but not broken. That was something. At least the sound of movement in the underbrush snapped his attention forward, his heart slamming against his ribs as he reached for the survival knife strapped to his thigh. He hadn't seen any signs of life aside from the insects, but he'd be a fool to think he had crashed alone on a planet teeming with vegetation. The movement came again, this time closer, the rustling leaves parting as someone stepped into the soft glow of the bioluminescent flora. Jackson's grip on the knife tightened instinctively, his pulse hammering in his ears as his gaze locked onto the figure before him. She was tall, easily 6 feet, her form and elegant, though every movement carried an underlying strength. Her skin was the color of deep jade, smooth and slightly luminescent in the low light, shimmering as she moved. Long dark tendrils of hair framed a striking face, high cheekbones, full lips, and eyes the color of liquid amber, slitted like a predator's. What struck him most, however, was the tail, long, sinuous, and tipped with a glowing, translucent, fin-like appendage that pulsed faintly with light. She regarded him with a mixture of curiosity and something else, something almost reverent. Jackson knew better than to make any sudden moves. She wasn't human, that much was clear, and the last thing he wanted to do was come across as a threat. He slowly lowered the knife, keeping his hands visible, though he doubted it would do much to dissuade her. If she decided he was prey, the alien woman took a cautious step forward, head tilting as she examined him, her amber gaze flickering to the wreckage behind him before returning to his face. Her lips parted, and she spoke, her voice lilting and melodic, though the words were entirely foreign to him. When he didn't respond, she frowned slightly, then moved closer, kneeling beside him with an air of quiet determination. Jackson tensed as she reached out, her fingers brushing against his arm, her touch surprisingly warm despite the cool sheen of her skin. He had no idea what she intended, but before he could react, she reached behind her tail curling forward, the glowing tip hovering just inches from his face. The scent hit him then, sweet, intoxicated, and strangely familiar, like the flowers that surrounded them, but deeper, richer. The translucent fin at the tip of her tail pulsed gently, and a thick, glistening droplet of golden liquid beaded at the very tip before falling into the palm of her hand. Jackson's instincts screamed at him to move, to resist, but before he could, she lifted her hand to his lips, pressing the warm nectar against them. He recoiled slightly, but she merely watched him expectantly, her expression unreadable. Drink, she murmured the word, somehow impossibly shaping itself into something he could understand, though the rest of her language remained a mystery. You are hurt. Drink. He hesitated, but something in her gaze compelled him. He was in no position to refuse help, especially not when he had no medical supplies, no way to tend to his wounds, and no knowledge of the planet's dangers. He parted his lips slightly, allowing the liquid to touch his tongue. The moment it hit his system, everything changed. A rush of heat flooded his veins, spreading outward in a wave of pure, electrifying sensation. His pain dulled almost instantly, his ribs no longer throbbing with each breath. His vision sharpened, the glow of the jungle around him intensifying, colors more vivid, details crisper. His pulse quickened, his body humming with energy, and for the first time since the crash he felt something close to whole. But there was something else, a warmth that wasn't just physical, an invisible thread weaving between him and the alien woman before him, something pulling him toward her in a way he didn't understand. Her eyes darkened as she watched him, satisfaction flickering across her features, her lips curving into a small, knowing smile. You are mine now, she whispered, her fingers grazing his cheek. Before he could even react to the weight of her words, Jackson's breath caught confusion, wearing with the undeniable pull between them, the strange heat still spreading through his limbs. He had no idea what had just happened, what the nectar had done to him, but deep in his bones he knew this was no ordinary act of kindness. Something had changed, something irreversible. Jackson could still feel the warmth coursing through his veins, the sensation lingering beneath his skin like an ember refusing to die out. His body no longer ached as it had before, the bruises along his ribs, the sharp sting of torn muscles, even the throbbing headache from the impact, all of it seemed to fade into the background, replaced by an unsettling, almost alien sense of clarity. His breath came easier, his heartbeat steady and strong, and yet despite the overwhelming relief of his recovery, there was something undeniably wrong. He swallowed against the lingering sweetness on his tongue, his throat still coated in the rich golden nectar she had given him. His fingers curled into the damp earth beneath him as he forced himself to focus, to push past the haze settling over his mind. The alien woman, Veyla, he would later learn, watched him with an almost unreadable intensity, her gaze unwavering as she remained close, too close, as though she expected something from him. Her tail still curled in a slow serpentine motion, flicked beside her, the luminescent tip pulsing in rhythm with his own heartbeat. Or was it the other way around? The realization sent a chill up his spine. Jackson exhaled sharply, shaking his head, his instinct screaming that something was happening to him, something he couldn't control. His body had healed too quickly, unnaturally so, and beneath the relief was a strange creeping sensation, an awareness that he was no longer entirely himself. He could feel her presence now, not just as a physical being beside him, but deeper, somewhere inside him, like an unseen thread weaving between their very existence. What the hell did you do to me? His voice was horror, rougher than he expected, and he hated the way it sounded, like a man on the edge of something he couldn't define. Veyla's lips parted slightly, her expression shifting, though whether it was amusement or something more complicated he couldn't tell. She reached out again, her fingers brushing against his arm, a simple touch that sent a surge of heat racing through his skin, his muscles tensing involuntarily. It wasn't pain, it wasn't exactly pleasure either, it was something far more primal, something that didn't belong to him. You drank, She murmured, her voice carrying a weight that sent another shiver up his spine. "Now you are mine." Jackson's body went rigid, his jaw clenching. As the words settled over him like a vice mine, the word held an unfamiliar power coming from her, as though it wasn't simply a declaration but a truth she expected him to accept without question. He forced himself to break eye contact, to push past the magnetic pull of her gaze, and focus on something, anything else. His survival instincts kicked in, reminding him that he was stranded on an alien planet, alone, vulnerable, and now apparently bound to a woman whose culture, whose very species, was a complete mystery to him. He needed answers. He needed to regain control. Taking a slow, deliberate breath, Jackson pulled himself up onto shaky legs, forcing himself to stand despite the strange sensation still coursing through his limbs. His body obeyed, but there was a moment of hesitation, an unfamiliar disconnect between his intent and his movement, as though he was adjusting to something that wasn't entirely his own anymore. Veyla rose with him, fluid and effortless, her head tilting slightly as she studied him. She was tall, standing nearly at eye level with him, and the closeness between them made the air feel charged, tense. He needed space, needed to think. But when he stepped back, her tail curled around his wrist, not forcefully, but enough to make him pause. "Let go," he said more firmly this time, though even as the words left his lips he could feel a deep, unspoken part of him resisting. Veyla regarded him for a long moment, then slowly, deliberately released him, her tail uncurling with a grace that felt almost reluctant. But the connection between them didn't break. It wouldn't. He could feel it now, an awareness that stretched beyond simple physicality. It was inside him, a link that had formed the moment he drank from her, one that refused to be severed. "You do not understand yet," she said finally, her voice quieter but no less firm. "But you will." Jackson ran a hand through his disheveled hair, frustration mounting as he tried to process everything. He was in unknown territory, in every sense of the word, and right now the only thing keeping him alive was the woman standing in front of him. Whether she was a savior or something far more dangerous remained to be seen. "Then help me understand," he said, keeping his voice measured. "What exactly did I drink?" Funk expression softened just slightly, but enough that he caught it. She gestured toward her tail, the tip still faintly glowing with residual nectar. "It is Isha, the life gift. It heals, it strengthens, it binds." She placed a hand over her own chest, then pointed to him. "Now we are one." Jackson exhaled sharply, running a hand over his face. "Okay," he muttered. "That's a lot to take in." His mind raced, dissecting her words, trying to make sense of them in any rational way. But the more he thought about it, the clearer it became. This wasn't just some medicinal remedy. This was something deeper, more permanent. Is this, he hesitated, forcing himself to meet her gaze, some kind of mating ritual? Her eyes darkened slightly at the question, a flicker of something unreadable passing through them, before she gave a small knowing nod. "It is more than that," she said simply. "You are my mate now, yes, but it is not just a choice. It is fate." The words should have sent him into a blind panic, should have made him recoil. But instead there was only acceptance and unspoken understanding between them that shouldn't have been there yet. It was the bond, was real, tangible, and a way he couldn't deny. He had felt it the moment the nectar touched his tongue, felt the way it had anchored him to her, as though the universe itself had rearranged something inside him to make room for her presence. A deep part of him, one he didn't want to acknowledge yet, wanted to believe her, but Jackson wasn't ready to accept anything so absolute, not yet. He took another step back, keeping his breathing steady, his thoughts grounded. "That's not how this works," he said, shaking his head. "I'm human, we don't just bond like this." V's expression didn't change, but there was something in the way she looked at him that sent a pulse of warmth through his chest. "You are not just human anymore," she said, and this time there was no room for doubt. Jackson's breath stalled. The words hit harder than he expected, settling deep into the marrow of his bones. He wanted to argue, to deny it, but the truth was already there, thrumming beneath his skin. In the way his senses had sharpened, in the way he could feel her presence, as if it were part of him. Now something had changed, and there was no going back. Jackson's mind refused to accept what his body already knew. Every breath he took was now every sensation, sharper, clearer, foreign, in a way he couldn't explain. The jungle air, once thick and oppressive, now carried a scent he could parse with eerie precision, Wet earth, the musk of unknown creatures moving beyond the tree line, the sweet and intoxicating perfume of her. His muscles, once sore and sluggish from the crash, no longer felt burdened by pain. Instead, they hummed with energy, as though his body had been reforged in the moments after he had assumed her nectar. It wasn't natural. None of this was natural, and yet the most unsettling part wasn't the changes themselves. It was how right they felt. Veyla watched him carefully, her amber eyes tracking his every movement, as though she could see the war raging inside of him. She had not moved away, nor had she tried to press closer, but the connection between them remained a tether that did not require touch to remind him it was there. He could still feel the residual warmth of her tail, where it had wrapped around his wrist, could still sense her presence inside his thoughts. Though not in words, it was a pulse, a quiet heartbeat, separate from his own whispering, that he was no longer just himself. He needed to break this. He needed distance. He needed to run. But even as the thought formed, something inside him resisted, a deep-rooted instinct warning him against it. The jungle was still an unknown variable, a world teeming with creatures and dangers he didn't understand. She was the only one who knew this place, the only one who had saved him, and whether he liked it or not, the only one who understood what was happening to him. How long? His voice came out rough, though, whether from frustration or lingering exhaustion, he couldn't tell. How long? Until I go back to normal. Veyla blinked, her expression unreadable for a moment, then softened in a way that made his stomach clench. You do not go back, she said, simply, with a certainty that sent a cold shiver up his spine. You are changed now. The bond has taken root. It will not break. His jaw tightened. That's not an answer. It is the only one that exists. Jackson exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over his face. The air between them was thick with tension, not hostility, but something more complicated, something that sent heat curling at the edges of his thoughts. He wanted to fight this, wanted to demand an explanation that made sense. But how could he argue with something his own body was already confirming? He had healed in minutes. His senses were heightened beyond anything humanly possible. He could feel her emotions without her speaking a word. This wasn't some psychological trick. It was real, and that terrified him. Where am I? He asked instead, forcing himself to focus on something more immediate. What is this planet? V's tail flicked slightly behind her, her expression shifting into something more neutral. This world is called Elan, she said. To your kind, it is unknown, unmarked, but to us it is home. Jackson's lips pressed into a thin line. The name meant nothing to him, which made sense. Orpheus 9 had been conducting research in deep space sectors that had never been explored by human colonization efforts. He had known there was a risk of encountering undiscovered life, but nothing had prepared him for this. And your people? He pressed. Where are they? At that, her expression darkened just slightly, but enough that he noticed. They will come, she said, though there was no warmth in the words. They will not be pleased to find you here. Jackson felt a flicker of unease tighten in his gut. He had suspected as much. If this bond between them was as significant as she claimed, then he had done something very, very wrong in the eyes of her people. Then I should leave, he said, testing the idea, though even as the words left his mouth, a sharp twisting sensation curled in his chest. Something inside him recoiling at the thought. He clenched his jaw, forcing himself to push through it. If they'll be looking for you, it's best if I'm not here when they arrive. Veyla stiffened, a flash of something dangerous passing through her gaze, and before he could react, her tail coiled around his forearm, again tighter. This time with undeniable force. No, she said, her voice low and final. You cannot leave me. Not now, not ever. Jackson's breath hitched, an unfamiliar heat rolling through his body at the contact, his pulse quickening in response. It wasn't fear, it wasn't anger, it was something else, something raw and instinctual, something he wasn't prepared to face. He swallowed hard, forcing his mind back into rational thought. V, listen to me, he said, carefully watching her closely. I don't belong here. I need to find a way back to my people. You have no people anymore, she said, and the pain in her voice was real, even if he didn't understand why. You drank, Jackson. The moment you accepted my gift, your fate was sealed. You are mine now, and I am yours. That is the way of my kind. There is no undoing it. Jackson felt his heart hammering in his chest, his breath coming quicker as her words sank in. No undoing it, no going back, and yet as terrifying As that realization was why did a part of him not want to resist it? Something was changing inside him, not just physically but mentally, emotionally, at the very core of his being. He could feel it, the pull toward her, the way his body responded to her nearness, the way the thought of leaving now sent a sharp ache through him. Was this the bond? Was this what she meant? Or was it something deeper, something that had been there all along, waiting for the moment to awaken? His fists clenched at his sides, his instincts warring with logic. But before he could argue further, the jungle around them stirred. A deep, distant sound rumbled through the trees, low and guttural, something unnatural, and approaching fast. Veyla's expression snapped into something sharp. Alert. Protective. They are coming, she said, her tail tightening briefly around his wrist. Before releasing him, we must go. Jackson didn't need to be told twice whatever was heading their way. He wasn't ready to face it, not like this, not when he still didn't understand what he had become. Veyla turned, moving with a grace that sent her long hair flowing behind her tail flicking with urgency. She glanced back, once her gaze locking onto his, and the unspoken message passed between them without need for words: stay with me, trust me. And despite everything, the confusion, the fear, the fight still raging inside him, Jackson followed. Jackson moved through the dense jungle behind Veyla, his breath controlled, but his mind anything but calm. His legs carried him with an ease that should not have been possible after the crash, but nothing about him felt the same anymore. His body no longer etched, his senses were hyper-aware of his surroundings, and the humid air that had once clung to his skin like a suffocating weight now felt inviting, almost natural. Every breath he took filled his lungs with the rich, earthy scent of the world around him, each sound sharp and distinct in his ears: the rustle of leaves underfoot, the distant hum of unseen creatures, the rhythmic swish of Veyla's tail as she led him deeper into the jungle. And then there was her. Even with distance between them, he could feel her presence, as if she were pressed against him, the strange, unnatural connection between them, pulling at him in ways he couldn't explain. He tried to ignore it, to focus on the immediate danger that lurked somewhere beyond the trees, but the bond refused to be ignored. It thrummed beneath his skin, whispering something intangible, something ancient and inescapable. He didn't want to think about what that meant. Who is coming? He asked, finally keeping his voice low as he followed her quick, silent strides. Veyla didn't slow, but her tail flicked once in acknowledgement. My people, she said, her tone neutral but layered with something he couldn't quite decipher. The hunters, they will track me, as they always do. Jackson's jaw tightened. Hunters. The words settled uneasily in his mind. They're after you, he asked, though he already suspected the answer. Why? For the first time since they started moving, she glanced back at him, her golden eyes flashing in the dim glow of the jungle's bioluminescent flora. There was no fear in them, no desperation, just an unwavering determination. Because I belong to them, she said, though there was a sharp edge to her voice now. And I do not wish to belong to them anymore. The words sent a strange, unwelcome sensation through Jackson's chest. He wasn't sure why it bothered him as much as it did, but something about the way she said it, the quiet defiance in her tone, made his hands clench into fists. He had spent his life studying alien ecosystems, plant life, and the intricacies of new worlds. But never had he encountered a species where the concept of belonging seemed so absolute. You're running, he realized, his voice lower now. This isn't just about me, is it? V gave him a look, then something that almost resembled amusement, but there was pain behind it, a flicker of something old and unspoken. You think too much human, she murmured, turning her focus forward again. But yes, I am running. I have been running for a long time. Jackson's mind worked through the implications as they moved swiftly through the thick foliage, ducking under broad glowing leaves, and stepping over thick vines that pulsed faintly with light. She wasn't just someone's prey, she was someone's prize. The realization made his stomach twist, though he wasn't sure why. Then why save me, he asked. After a moment, pushing forward even as his instincts told him that he might not like the answer. If you knew helping me would slow you down. V was silent for a beat too long. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer than before. Because I could not leave you, she admitted, though there was something strained in the way she said it, as if she didn't quite understand it herself. The bond does not allow it. Jackson exhaled slowly, forcing himself to confront what he had been trying to avoid, the bond, whatever she had done to him. Whatever her species' traditions dictated, it wasn't something he could just shake off. He had felt it the moment he had swallowed the nectar, the invisible thread weaving itself into his very being. This was more than biology, more than science. It was something else. Before he could say anything more, Veyla suddenly stopped, one hand raised in warning. Jackson reacted instantly, his body responding before his mind even had time to process the command he dropped. Low instinct guiding him, his back pressing against the thick bark of a tree as he strained to listen. A sound, distant but growing closer, deep rhythmic footfalls, heavier than his or Veyla's. Methodical in their approach, Jackson knew that sound. It was the sound of trained hunters moving in formation. His muscles tensed. Whoever was coming, they weren't just wandering, they were tracking. Veyla turned to him, her expression unreadable, but her eyes said everything. They are near, she whispered. We do not have long. Jackson nodded, his mind already running through options. None of them good. Do they know exactly where we are? Veyla hesitated, and for the first time Jackson saw something close to uncertainty flicker across her expression. Perhaps, she admitted, her voice tight. But they will not stop, not until they have me. Jackson's jaw clenched. And him, was he just an obstacle? Now a problem to be dealt with? Or did they consider him something worse? Something claimed he could feel Veyla watching him, waiting for his response, as if testing him. He knew what she expected. Him to say that he would run, that he would abandon this problem that wasn't his, that he would try to find another way off this planet, one that didn't involve her people, her past, or the bond neither of them had asked for. But when Jackson opened his mouth, the words that left him weren't the ones he had expected. Then we fight. Veyla's eyes widened slightly, the first true sign of surprise he had seen from her. You would stay, she asked, her voice quieter now. But there was something else beneath it, something he wasn't ready to name. Jackson exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. Not like I have much of a choice, do I? He muttered, though there was no real frustration behind the words, because the truth was some part of him already knew he wasn't going anywhere. And it had nothing to do with the bond. Veyla studied him for a long moment. Then, for the first time since they met, she smiled. It was small, barely there, but it was real, and something inside Jackson tightened at the sight of it. Then we fight, she agreed, and in that moment, Jackson knew there was no turning back. Whatever happened next, he was already in too deep. Jackson had never been a fighter. He had always been the kind of man who believed in logic, reason, and survival through intelligence rather than brute force. He had trained for survival, yes, every astronaut and deep space scientist had, but theoretical drills in controlled environments could never compare to the raw, visceral reality of the situation he found himself in now. This was not some wild animal or an environmental hazard. He could outmaneuver. These were people, sentient, intelligent hunters with purpose and weapons, and a reason to come for them. And yet, despite the very real and rational part of his mind that told him to run, to cut ties before he got himself in even deeper, he didn't move. He wasn't sure if it was the bond. Maybe it was. Maybe the tail nectar that still pulsed through his system had done more than just heal him. Maybe it had rewired him in ways he still couldn't comprehend. But deep down in the pit of his gut, he knew that wasn't the full story. Veyla, she had saved him, she had bound him to her, maybe accidentally, maybe not. She had risked herself for a complete stranger. And now her past had caught up with her, dragging him along for the ride. Jackson inhaled sharply, keeping his breath measured. He could hear the hunters now, their movements calculated, sweeping through the jungle like predators who had done this 100 times before. His heartbeat had settled into something too calm, his body adjusting to the heightened awareness that came with whatever the nectar had done to him. He could hear the subtle crunch of leaves under careful footfalls, the quiet shifting of weight from one step to the next. They were close. V's stance had shifted, her form tense, ready, her golden eyes narrowed and locked on the unseen threat. Her tail flicked behind her, slow and deliberate, the glowing tip pulsing with something like anticipation. She wasn't afraid. If anything, she looked like she had been waiting for this. Jackson, however, was not ready for what happened next. A figure burst from the thick underbrush, moving faster than any human could, a blur of emerald skin and dark armor, armed with something long and curved, a weapon Jackson didn't recognize. VA reacted instantly, her body twisting in a blur of fluid grace, her tail snapping out like a whip. The glowing tip struck the attacker across the chest, sending them staggering back just enough for her to lunge forward, striking hard and fast. Jackson barely had time to register the fact that he should be helping, not just standing there like an idiot. He had no weapon, but his instincts, or maybe something deeper than that, took over. Another hunter emerged, this one faster, more precise, moving straight for him. Jackson didn't think, he just moved. His body reacted with a speed he didn't understand, his reflexes sharper than they had ever been. He ducked the incoming blow. Sid stepped in before he could second-guess himself, grabbed a fallen branch, swinging it with full force into the hunter's ribs. The impact sent a shock of his arms, the force far stronger than he expected. The hunter let out a sharp sound, something between a growl and a snarl, that didn't go down. Jackson barely had time to breathe before the alien warrior turned, eyes locking onto him with renewed focus. The hunter lunged again, but this time Jackson saw it before it happened. His muscles moved before his mind could process it, his body anticipating the attack as if he had done this before, as if something deep inside him already knew how to fight like this. He ducked under the hunter's strike, twisting sharply to the side, and in one fluid motion he struck again, harder, faster, precise. The branch connected with the side of the warrior's head this time, and the force was enough to send them sprawling to the ground. Jackson took a step back, his breath coming harder now, his muscles buzzing with something unnatural. This wasn't adrenaline, this was different. He turned sharply to check on Veyla, just in time to see her take down her own opponent with a final decisive movement. Her tail wrapped around their weapon, yanking it free before she struck hard, fast enough that the hunter collapsed in a heap at her feet. For a moment, the jungle was silent. Then another sound, louder, more movement from the trees. V's gaze snapped toward Jackson, her breathing even but her eyes fierce. "There are more," she said, her voice steady but urgent. "We cannot fight them all." Jackson exhaled sharp, still adjusting to the fact that he had just fought an alien warrior and won, but she was right. There was no way they could take on an entire hunting party, not out in the open like this. He glanced around, scanning the dense jungle for options. "We need cover," he said, his voice calmer than he expected. "Somewhere we can hold them off or lose them entirely." Va hesitated for only a second before she nodded, gesturing for him to follow. "This way," she said, already moving her form, cutting through the jungle like she had lived in it her whole life, which of course she had. Jackson followed, his body still thrumming with unnatural energy, his heartbeat steady despite the chaos unfolding around them. His mind raced, trying to process everything: the hunters, the fight, the way his body had reacted like it had always been meant to do this. What was happening to him? Va led him toward a steep incline, a cluster of jagged rock formations jutting out of the earth. Without hesitation, she grabbed onto one of the stone ledges and climbed, her movements effortless. Jackson followed, surprised again by how easily his body responded, how his limbs obeyed without hesitation. The climb should have been difficult. It wasn't. They reached a narrow overhang, a natural hiding spot carved into the rock. V crouched low, motioning for Jackson to do the same. He pressed himself against the stone, his breathing controlled, his ears straining to catch any signs of pursuit. The jungle remained eerily still. Va exhaled softly, her shoulders relaxing just a fraction. "They will search," she murmured, "but they will not find us easily here." Jackson nodded, though his thoughts were still racing. He turned to her, studying her face in the dim light of the jungle glow. "This bond," he said quietly, "it's doing something to me, isn't it?" V met his gaze, her golden eyes unreadable. "Yes," she admitted without hesitation. "This time you are changing." Jackson swallowed hard, his fingers curling into his palm. He already knew that, he just didn't know what he was becoming. Jackson sat in the dim light of the rocky alcove, his back pressed against the cool stone as he worked to steady his breathing. The jungle below them had gone quiet, the sounds of their pursuers fading into the depths of the thick, glowing foliage. His muscles still hummed with residual energy and unnatural sharpness that he couldn't ignore, a lingering awareness of something more than himself. His heart was still beating faster than it should have been, but not from exertion. No, this was different. His body was adapting, adjusting, becoming something else. He could feel it in the way his skin prickled at the humidity instead of resisting it, in the way his breath came steady, even though it should have been. Ragged from the fight, he had moved too easily anticipated attacks. Before they had even been thrown, it was as though something deeper than instinct had taken over, something buried within him that had only woken up after he drank from her. He exhaled sharply, raking a hand through his damp hair, his fingers lingering at the nape of his neck, where a strange warmth had settled, a tingling sensation. Just beneath the surface, it hadn't been there before. Across from him, Veyla watched.